I'd like you to open your Bibles with me this morning to John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. John 1, verses 1 to 18. I'm not going to read it in advance, but we'll read it as we make our way through the points in this message. Most of you are familiar with the allegory that Plato gave in his book called The Republic, years before the coming of Christ. And in this allegory, which is called the cave allegory, there are a group of individuals seated in a cave, and they're chained to the wall of the cave, and their heads are chained so that they point forward only. And on the cave wall in front of them, they see shadows of plants and animals and people who are actually behind them over a wall that they can't see, and there's a great fire, a great light behind those people and plants and animals and things that are casting their shadow on the wall. And as they walk by, the people are talking and it reflects off the wall, and the people in the cave are thinking, this is life. This is all they know. This is all they've ever known. This is life, a life of darkness and shadows cast upon a wall. That's a pretty good illustration of what life in this world is, or at least what it appears to be to the world. Now, in John's Gospel, the term the world doesn't refer to his created world. Rather, it refers to those who are in the world who are in rebellion against God. In fact, when one becomes a believer, he's no longer considered of the world. John 17 says to believers, you are not of the world. You're not of the world. But the world is chained to the cave wall, living a life of shadows in darkness. This week has all been about a $700 billion bailout of various investment companies and banks, and terms have been used like this is the economic equivalent of Pearl Harbor, or an economic Armageddon, I heard somebody say, or unprecedented, or the phrase long and painful recession you heard, and on occasion even the word depression, conjuring up all kinds of images of fear and doubt. And that's nothing but life in this world. It's a life of shadows. It's the life, both those who are behind the crisis and those who are living in such dread and fear of some economic collapse. It's nothing but a life in the shadows, where life consists of the abundance of our possessions. Paul David Tripp calls it a shrink-wrapped life. It's a life of smallness and narrowness and darkness and fear. And that's the characteristic of this dark world that we'll hear later on. God so loved that He gave His only begotten Son. What John is trying to do in this gospel is to take people whose heads have been focused in one direction and only knows shadows and darkness, and to turn them 180 degrees to see that behind them there is real life. There is an abundant life. And there is a light that's real and great that they have no knowledge of. And He's taken their heads and He's just saying, look! Would you just look? There is life and there is light. Would you believe and live? and be free. The first 18 verses of John's Gospel is what we call the prologue. And in this prologue of the Gospel, John is basically giving us the big vision of this light that shines and gives life. He's giving us the big picture here. It's as though he's got a wide-angle lens out and he's taking a picture of the sun that gives light. And he's saying, look, he's saying, I'm going to tell you all about this light as he interacts with real people in our world. But right now, I just want you to see the big sun, the big picture, the big light. But the snapshot in this prologue is so large that we're going to need to take it in 4 parts, okay? Like a large picture, we're going to just pan from your direction from left to right. We're going to just pan in 4 stages from left to right. And so we could call this 4 exposures of the light of this world, of the true light. The first exposure, or the first look at this great glorious light, is in verses 1 through 5. And we talked about this in great detail last week, so I'm not going to belabor this first point. But in these first 5 verses, John is exalting the light. This is the exaltation of the light. He's telling us who this light is, who is a man whom we know as Jesus. And he's giving us not a picture of a man, but a picture of God. This man who is God. And in these verses, follow along with me as we read them, and I'll continue that sentence. Verses 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. In this exaltation of the light, remember, John is reflecting on Genesis 1, isn't he? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God spoke and said with His word, let there be light. And there was light. And then later on, let there be life. And there was life. And this light of men that John is talking about here was, he says, the eternal, pre-existing, self-revelation Word of God, by whom God created. This is an exaltation of the light. When God said, let there be light, there was the Word. This Word, God spoke, and it was. And He's telling us that was Christ creating. And when God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures, there again was the Word, which is the light. And this Word is Christ. And when God said, let us make man, there again is God's creative Word, whom we know as Jesus, bringing life. In other words, John is saying it's a new Genesis. God is bringing light into a dark world. God is bringing a new order out of disorder of sin. God is bringing cosmos out of chaos. Like unto Genesis 1, but far more profoundly. It's a new beginning. And we just might reflect on that in light of what we heard earlier this morning, that Jesus brings new beginnings. He is the life. This Word, he says, is not itself a creation of God, but is a distinct being with God, but more than that, He is God. That Word as light he goes on to say, is both incomprehensible by darkness, darkness doesn't get it, and is invincible to darkness, darkness has not and will not overcome it. The light will shine. So it's the exaltation of the light. Moving on to a new category, panning to the right a little bit now, we come to verses 6 through 8. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. Now there's two Johns that we need to keep straight. There's the author John, who is the apostle who followed Jesus, and then there's the John that he's writing about, who is John the Baptist. And that's the John in these verses. This is John the Baptist. He's not the light, but came to bear witness to the light. And that's the second point, the witness to the light. John is like the moon, in other words. What's the moon do? The moon reflects the glory of the sun at night. How do we know there's a light out there called the sun when it's dark in here? Because of the moon that testifies to the light. Now, when I first read these verses, or as I was contemplating these verses and studying these verses, the question I had was, John the writer, why do you bring in John the Baptist at this point? I mean, you're presenting the Word which was with God and was God, and there's this magnificent, glorious exaltation of the light of man, and then you talk about John the Baptist. Not that John the Baptist isn't great. In fact, Jesus said he's the greatest prophet that there was. He's the greatest man who ever lived up to that point. But it seems like that's anticlimactic. Let me tell you about the Word. Now then there was John the Baptist. Why? That's what I was asking myself. Why do you bring John in at this point? And it occurred to me that he gives us the answer in chapter 20. Remember when we did an overview of John's Gospel a few weeks ago, we looked at John 20, verses 30 and 31. This is the purpose statement of the book, but look with me there, and I think we'll see why he brings John in already in chapter 1. Verse 30 says, Now Jesus did many other signs, here's the key phrase, in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and have life in His name. The key phrase is in the presence of the disciples. Now, normally we would just read over that and not think a thing about it, but what's the point? Why were these signs done in the presence of the disciples? Because John is looking for eyewitnesses. John is full of eyewitness reports to who Jesus is as the Christ and the Son of God. And John the Baptist is the first key witness, the first eyewitness. John the writer is giving us evidence through testimonies to who Jesus is. So he brings John the Baptist in here right up front in order to say, here's my first witness. And in fact, isn't that how John is designated? He came as a witness, to bear witness about the light. So it's perfectly appropriate in a book full of witnesses that he introduces John the Baptist first. For he is the forerunner of Christ, sent himself from God, even as Jesus is sent from God. You know, the Apostle John, the writer of this book, isn't like a Mormon here. You know how, I don't know if you've talked to Mormons much, but I had a friend I worked with who was a Mormon, and he was sharing with me what he believed, and he said to me, at the end, he said, if you pray about this, you will have a warm feeling that confirms the truth of it. But that's not what John's doing, is he? He's not saying, now, here, let me tell you some things about Jesus, and now if you pray, you'll have a warm feeling and you'll know that it's true. He's not trying to persuade us through our warm feeling responses to something. By the way, we can have warm feelings in response to almost anything. It is not a safe guide. But John's not persuading us like that. Neither is John presenting himself as a great scientist who's giving us hard proof, archaeological evidence or scientific evidence that where he's going to demonstrate as if in a science lab or a test tube who Jesus is. As though science could do that. Science can't do that. It is a statement of faith who Jesus is. But rather, he's not like a Mormon, he's not like a scientist, but rather he's like a lawyer. As I said, bringing first one witness, one eyewitness, and then another to testify. John the Baptist is the greatest of that. You know what's so amazing to me about that is that the sun should so evidently be shining, spiritually speaking. The sun should so evidently be shining in this world, and yet we need a witness. We need a whole series of witnesses to point it out to us. That speaks to me of how much in darkness we truly are. There are two themes that you'll notice as we go through this section that are highlighted. One is how deep is the darkness in this world, but secondly, how great is the light that scatters it. And John comes as a witness because we need witnesses, because we love the darkness so much. Third pan, let's go one more stage to the right, to verses 9 through 13, and let's see in these verses the reaction to the light. The reaction to the light. Verse 9. The true light, not the reflected light, the true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. That's a reference to the incarnation of the Word, the incarnation of God, the incarnation who we know is Jesus. The enfleshing of Jesus. That true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, literally not of bloods, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. The reaction to the light. Now there's some questions here, beginning in verse 9, that I want to address very briefly. First of all, when he says the true light which enlightens everyone, that's the English Standard Version translation. The true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. What does he mean there? In what sense does he enlighten everyone? Does that mean that when Jesus came into the world through the incarnation, somehow he gives spiritual knowledge and understanding to everybody in the whole world? Suddenly, everybody has a grasp on ultimate reality. Everybody knows what's behind them outside the cave. He enlightens everyone. And that's the way we would tend to think, because that word enlightenment or enlighten tends to mean to us an inner enlightenment, an inner learning, an inner awareness. But that's not what John means here, clearly, because the next verse, he says he came, the world was made through him, but the world did not know him, and his own didn't receive him. Clearly, not everyone is enlightened in the sense of accepting and receiving the true light. So what does he mean? Well, what he simply means is that in the incarnation, Jesus comes like the sun rising over the horizon, shining on everyone that he touches, but not in a way that it penetrates the soul and enlightens everyone, but in such a way that it demonstrates the reality of everyone. This light that comes into the world exposes everybody. It exposes, like light, everybody. And it divides all humanity into two groups. Those who hate the light and flee from it, and those who receive it and are given life. So why do I think that's the case? Because, remember, the prologue, these 18 verses are in miniature what's throughout the whole rest of the book. I mean, it helps us understand as we go through the stories that are to come, it'll help us understand what's happening in those stories. But in the same way, those stories help us to understand what he's saying in the prologue too. So look at chapter 3 with me for a minute, verses 19 through 21, and it explains what he means by the true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. It'll explain what that means. Chapter 3, verse 19. And this is the judgment. That is the thing which divides between people, or the thing which brings a conclusion. This is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. How do you know who those people are? The light shines. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. This light brings a distinction, it brings a separation, it brings a judgment. And as this light rises over the horizon, those who love darkness scatter like cockroaches for cover. So these verses, especially verses 10 through 13, that we'll read again, these verses show just how much the world loves darkness. Just how much. I think that's the thing that surprised me the most as I studied through this. Just how much the world loves darkness. Verse 10. How much did the world love darkness? He was in the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. We are so captivated by darkness that though our very Creator comes to us, His own beloved world, He appears to us as a stranger. Who's that? What a remarkable thing for the pot to say to the potter. Verse 11, we so love darkness that though Jesus comes to His own people, His very own home, the people of Israel, He's despised and rejected and cast out like a common thief or robber. Who is this one who comes in to rob our house? Though it's His own house. So it's a statement of how deep is this darkness, how much we love darkness in this world. How truly did Isaiah say, the ox knows its owner and the donkey knows its master's crib, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand. When I was a high school student in Spanish class, my friends and I had a favorite slogan we would recite to each other. Mi burro sabe más que tú. my donkey knows more than you. That's what we're reading here. A donkey knows its master. But my people, my world does not know me. Our friend Hunter Grove, whom you know, suffered serious brain injury a few months ago. We didn't know if he would live. He's coming home from rehabilitation October 16th, I think, Lord willing. But though he suffered extensive brain injury, when he began to be just a little bit conscious, he recognized the voices of his mom and his dad. We're worse off than that in darkness. Worse than the most serious brain damage. The Creator comes to His own world, and we don't recognize Him. The reaction to the light shows our darkness. In verses 12 and 13, really, this is the part that surprised me the most, I think. They really reveal how blind and in darkness we are. Look again, verse 12. But to all who did receive Him, who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. You say, how does that reveal our darkness in this? First of all, there is glorious hope here. There is wonderful, remarkable, blessed hope here. That those who receive Him are given the right, the authority to become children of God. That's all our hope. Yet, he goes on to say in verse 13 that we in the world so love darkness that unless God reaches in and does something sovereignly, lovingly, patiently, we will not receive Him. You see that in verse 13? Who were born. He introduces the born again subject here that'll follow through in chapter 3. But who were born not of blood. What does that mean? Not of natural procreation that comes from what the ancients saw as the mixing of bloods. It did not come, they were born not of natural procreation, nor of the will of the flesh, that's sexual desire, nor of the will of the man or of the husband who says, come on, honey. Not born that way. In other words, this isn't a natural thing. This birth is a supernatural, spiritual reality that only comes by the will and at the hand of a sovereign God who so loves this world that rather than leave us in the depth of our darkness that we pursue with all of our might, He reaches down and He transforms us and gives us a new heart and lifts us up over the cave wall and says, look, behold the light and live. You know, we talk about and sometimes argue about the sovereignty of God and the doctrines of grace, that He chose us from before the foundation of the world, irrespective of anything either we would do or say, and that His Spirit comes with irresistible grace and transforms us and calls us to Himself. And I believe that's the gospel with all my heart. But we argue as if God is somehow this meanie who just keeps us from coming, as though we would want to. And that misses the whole point. John is very clear to say the problem is a moral problem in my world, that we so love darkness that whatever grace He pours out upon us externally, we despise Him and run from Him and crucify him. This birth, this becoming children of God, this receiving the Word who became flesh, this receiving of Christ our God, isn't something we have the natural capability to do because we love darkness by nature and won't come to Him no matter how kind He is to us unless He does something for us and to us. It's an evidence. This irresistible grace isn't an evidence of the meanness of God to force people dragging and kicking into the kingdom or to keep people out of the kingdom. It is the only hope we have, and God gives it abundantly and graciously. That's the glory of irresistible grace. Some of you heard the phrase in the Batman movie about when an irresistible force meets an immovable object. That wasn't originated with the Joker. That's a historic philosophical question. What happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object? And God is telling us about our own hearts that they are by nature, we are born as immovable objects who will not give way unless an irresistible force, the power of the Holy Spirit, comes and transforms us so that we become movable by our own will. That's what it is to be born again, to be given a new heart by a God who so loves this wicked world. It's a glorious testimony to His love and to our hatred of that love. The rejection or the reaction to the light. Finally, fourthly, verses 14 through 18, panning to the last exposure of this great light. I call it the revelation of the light. The revelation or the revealing of the light. Read with me, verses 14 through 18. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory. Notice he's saying we were witnesses. We have seen His glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about Him and cried out, "This was He of whom I said, He who comes after me ranks before me because He was before me." John the Baptist knew of Jesus' eternality. Verse 16, and from His fullness, not John's fullness, but the Son's fullness, from His fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made Him known. At the beginning of this section, John, the writer, was in Genesis 1, reflecting on Genesis 1. Here in this final section of the prologue, he's in Exodus, particularly verses 33 and 34. Let me review quickly with you Exodus. Do you remember Israel comes out of Egypt? Their exodus out of Egypt. They come to Mount Sinai. God gives Israel His law, His 10 commandments. The Hebrew calls it His 10 words. God gives His 10 words. Then He gives other various sundries of laws. In the meantime, the people are down at the foot of the mountain deciding, we don't know what happened to Moses. He's been gone 40 days and 40 nights. Let's make a statue in the form of a golden calf and call it the God that brought us out of Egypt. Let's take it. Let's go back to Egypt. Moses comes down the mountain. His anger burns with the people. He throws down the 10 words and breaks it on the ground as they've broken it in their hearts. And then Moses goes back up on the mountain. in chapter 33, and he begins to plead with God for God's own people. And then Moses said in verse 18 of that chapter, he says, please, please show me your glory. I want to see your glory. And God said to Moses, you cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live. Nevertheless, God hid Moses in the cleft of the rock and put his hand there as a cover, and he passed by and let Moses see his backside, as it were, the afterglow of his glory. And then God gave Moses his 10 words again upon a new set of the tablets of stone, his law. And then God says to him, God proclaims to Moses his glory through these words, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and truth. Steadfast love and truth. Abounding in these things. And the word used for steadfast love is a word that emphasizes the graciousness of his love. And John's meditating on that, as it were, in Exodus 33 and 34. And in these verses, he refers first of all to the tabernacle that God, I left that part out of the story, I shouldn't have, but God gave instructions for the tabernacle to Moses while he was on the mountain, this movable tent where God was to dwell in the midst of his people as they travel through the wilderness. And John says in verse 14, this word that I've been talking about, this word that was with God, and this word that was God, and this word through which all things came into being, this word became flesh and literally in the Greek, tabernacled among us. He is the very locus of God's presence in our midst. He is the tabernacle, and He dwelt among us, and we have seen His what? His glory. You remember Moses? Show me your glory. The glory as of the one and only, the unique one from the Father, the exceptional one, full of, abounding in grace and truth. Exodus 34. Verse 6, straight out of that. What's John saying to us? John is saying to us that in Jesus alone, in Christ, in Jesus Christ alone, the glory of God is revealed. And it's no afterglow. It is brilliant, Shekinah, light, glory. And we saw it. And we're here to tell you about it. And then in verse 15, he inserts John's testimony again to undergird what he's saying. And then in verse 16, he says, of His fullness we have all received. Of what fullness? That goes back to verse 14. Full of grace and truth. Here's Jesus, full, abounding, overflowing in grace and truth. And of that abundance, of that overflowing of grace and truth, we who believe in Him have received. It overflows to us and in us and for us. And I want to come back to that in a moment. And then he says, grace upon grace. Literally, the phrase means not grace upon grace, but grace in the place of grace. Grace instead of grace. Say, what does he mean, grace in the place of grace? What's he talking about? Well, verse 17 explains it. Here's the grace and the grace. For the law was given through Moses. That's grace. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. What's he saying? That in Jesus Christ we receive an abundance of grace, an abundance of glory, an abundance of all that God is received by us, that makes what Israel received through Moses appear to be as nothing in comparison. It's grace in the place of what was grace, genuinely, but only in anticipation. The grace of Christ far excels and supersedes, because of it, the grace that was given through Moses in the law. The point is that this word, this dark dispelling light, this word, we've seen it, we've beheld it, he said, and the fullness of grace in that one flowed over to us. I've been reading lately a book by Jonathan Edwards called The End for Which God Created the World. It is a little bit of a difficult read, but it is a glorious read, to take it bit by bit. And Jonathan Edwards says in that book, he says, thus it is fitting, since there is an infinite fountain of knowledge and light, that this light should shine forth in beams of communicated knowledge and understanding. And as there is an infinite fountain of holiness, moral excellence, beauty, so that it should flow out in communicated holiness. And that as there is an infinite fullness of joy and happiness in God, so these should become a fountain flowing out in abundant streams as beams from the sun. John Piper's summary of that paragraph is, it is fitting that a full fountain should send forth abundant streams. Now see, that's what John is saying here. John is saying Christ is so abounding, so full, so overflowing in grace and truth, which is just a summary of all that He is, and His glory and His beauty and His majesty and all the blessing that He has for us. He is so full of this grace and truth that He has sent forth abundant streams of grace to us in Jesus Christ. That's a good news for a dark world. That is good news for a dark world. And then he closes with this verse, verse 18. No one has ever seen God. Remember Moses. God says, no one can see my face and live. Though Moses saw, as it were, an afterglow, it wasn't a full-fledged vision of the glory of God, for no man can see it and live. And John affirms that here. He says, no one has ever seen God. But, there's a but implied there. No one has ever seen God, but the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has literally explained Him. You know, the Greek word there for made known is the word exegete. You hear about biblical exegesis, it just means explanation. And he's saying, Jesus, who is with God at the Father's side, or at the Father's breast, speaking of their intimate relationship, this Jesus who is with God and who is God, the only God, He has exegeted Him. He's made God known. No man has seen God until now. And He fully reveals Himself in Jesus Christ. And brothers and sisters, let me not hesitate to say this, that the fullest exegesis, the fullest explanation of God, as we'll see as we go along, doesn't come in the incarnation, but it comes at the cross. You want to know God? in His full glory and mercy and truth and grace. Look at the cross. There, Jesus exegetes the Father fully, and we see His glory. At the cross, Jesus is, as it were, the shining torches of Gideon that were covered by the clay vessels until those clay pots were shattered and the light sprang forth and they went forward and captured their enemies. And it's as though those clay vessels were broken at the cross and God's glory blazed in its fullest expression. Shekinah glory. The veil was torn in two as if to say, look and behold the presence of the living God. Look and see and not die, but live forever. And so the question he leaves us with is this: will you look? Will you look? Jesus, as He's revealed through eyewitnesses on the pages of Scripture, He is the revelation of the glory of God that Moses so longed to see, but couldn't in his day. Will you look and behold? Will you look and believe John's eyewitness? Will you receive that word and that light? And will you live? Will you live? Any negative response to that is only, it has nothing to do with God's unwillingness. It has everything to do with our love of darkness. Look and live.